Welcome to the Think Like Amazon podcast, the show where I sit down with former Amazon executives to discuss Amazon's unique principles and processes and tease out how you can apply them to grow and manage your business. I'm Tyler Wallis, a 7-year former Amazonian, current brand consultant, and your host as we learn to think like Amazon.
Welcome, everybody, to the Think Like Amazon podcast. My name is Jorge Luis Pando, and I am not your traditional host of this podcast, but Tyler and I continue talking after our last interview, and we realized that he has been through a lot since you last heard from him in the podcast. So it was a really good time for the tables to turn and for me to take over and ask him some questions. So, Tyler, I'm not even going to attempt to do an introduction of you. A lot of the listeners know who you are. They've been listening to you for a while, but I'll let you jump right into it. You've been doing this podcast for several tries, a lot of times, interviewing a lot of different guests. And now is the time for us to get to know you a little bit more on like the guest chair. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your career path at Amazon, what led you to Amazon, your highlights in your time there, and what you're up to nowadays?
You bet. And Jorge, this is a lot of fun to be on the other side of the table, so to speak, with this episode here. So I'm excited to share a little bit and also be the one interviewed this time. So as you mentioned, some of the guests might already be familiar with me, or at least be familiar with me hosting others on the show. But to give a little bit of background on myself, of course, I also worked at Amazon, and I came to Amazon in 2013. It was like a lifetime ago at this point, but I had worked for an online grocery delivery company for a few years, similar to Amazon Fresh or Instacart before either of those were around. And then went to business school at UCLA and got an offer to intern at Amazon during the summer. So summer of 2013 was my first experience there. And a quick example that I think was pivotal for me ending up full time at Amazon and also ties in with some of what we're going to talk about with the ownership leadership principle today is I was hired as an intern to launch the grocery category for Amazon Canada. You know, I think most people, myself included, was completely floored to be given such a big task as an intern. But no, it surely was like on me to get this category launched. And if I didn't do it, it would probably be postponed or who knows what would have happened. And so it was really a new market for this category in Amazon. And my responsibility was to build the go-to-market plan. Like how is this going to be feasible? What logistics and supply chain is needed? What selection is needed? And then actually to go out and start recruiting some of the early brands and products to start filling this selection. A little bit of the urgency is it was slated to launch in October of 2013. So I started my internship in June, and I was basically told, hey, this is going to launch in just a few months. So you better get it right the first time around. So it was a bit daunting. It was super fun, very consulting like project, and which I would say is typical for many of the MBA internships at Amazon, at least at the time. And I remember at the time, one of the obstacles I came up against is I needed to figure out one big piece of this project was figuring out what selection, so what products do we need to have to be credible as a category on Amazon? Like we don't want to open our doors, figuratively speaking, with this category launch and not have what customers are really looking for. And again, this is shelf-stable groceries. So we're not talking your fresh milk and eggs. We're talking about everything on the middle aisles of the grocery store. And the problem was that there weren't many online grocery competitors at the time. Again, this was pre-Instacart. So you didn't have many online displays or portals for many of the grocery stores. And the grocery stores were, some of them overlapped with the US, but many didn't. And so I had to figure out what selection our customers can actually care about. And I remember there were a few different interns that had similar projects to mine to help put together go-to-market plans for other categories. And a lot of them were equally, a bit discouraged with the task and, just looking at whatever online resources were available. And what I ended up doing is figuring out, well, there's not really a whole lot I can gather or scrape online. But look, I am in Seattle, which is about a 4 hour drive from the Canadian border in Vancouver. And so I ended up taking a big stack of papers and a clipboard and getting in my car and driving over a weekend to Vancouver. And I spent 2 full days just going to every Loblaws, every Walmart Canada. I visited probably 8 to 10 different grocery stores, and knowing that while selection might vary from East Coast to West Coast, most of the Canadian grocery buyers were national at the Canadian level. And so the selection would be generally representative, even in Vancouver. And I basically just went down every single aisle and wrote down all of the brands within each category that I saw on the shelf, the relative shelf space that they had, and then what were the top 5 to 10 brands per category based on relative shelf space. And by the time I got back, I was able to like transpose all those notes into a document and some spreadsheets and basically back my way into which brands do we need to be credible with the existing players in the grocery market in Canada, and which ones do we need to be given the most relative share of shelf, digital shelf too. And anyways, it was a really a big turning point in that project, and it really kind of helped things accelerate towards launch and onboarding those important vendors for launch. And I won't forget the soon after my internship ended, I was super happy to get a full time offer back to Amazon, and they specifically called out that that ownership and that scrappiness to not get blocked and to go out and do something creative to get the data that I needed was, really recognized by the VP and others in the org, and a big contributing factor to getting an offer at Amazon. That's a little bit of a story that I think kind of shows one of the things I enjoyed about my time at Amazon, given that autonomy, but also that ownership leadership principle. Fast forward, I came back. I had multiple roles, as many Amazonians do, over 6, 7 years. I was a category manager for consumer electronics and PC specifically. Then I went over to the buyer or 1P vendor manager side of the business and led a team for home improvement and smart home. And this was in Amazon US. And then after a few years on the vendor buyer side, I went over to Amazon Canada again, still based out of the Seattle office. And my last few years were spent leading marketing for consumer electronics. I really had three components to the role. So one was marketing leader. Two was I led the environmental compliance programs for Canada. And then three, and the most significant for me, and probably in terms of scope, was leading the marketplace or third party business for Amazon Canada. So really enjoy the opportunity to own some big P&Ls and to get a lot of purview over this general manager type role and team. So yeah, that obviously skips through many years of experience pretty quickly, but that takes me up until February 2021, where mid pandemic, I'd moved to Southern California and decided that it was the right time to scratch the entrepreneurial itch I had and embark on the next chapter. And soon after started this podcast. So that's a little bit about the Amazon background. Since then, I spent about a year consulting 60 to 80 million dollar sellers, so larger sellers and brands on Amazon, and then soon after saw an opportunity to launch an Amazon focused agency, Triple Line, which is where I am today. So Triple Line specifically helps better for you CPG brands to scale profitably on Amazon. So we have a boutique team that includes several former Amazonians, and we work specifically with brands to help them grow their sales on the Amazon platform.
Such an amazing story, such a diverse story. I want to touch a little bit on the ownership side of things. I think you mentioned ownership a couple of times. I think that story of not having data and just like grabbing your car keys and driving 4 hours to Canada, I think it's a really great example of what definitely sets some Amazonians apart, right? I've seen a lot of people do similar things to go above and beyond to, well, in your example, it was both the data, but also like there's a lot of customer obsession involved. There's a lot of people who do that. This is prior the age of AI, prior the age of having a lot of this data in the palm of our hands, right? So rolling up your sleeve, going getting the data of yourself, or going doing something. I remember there's this stereotype of marketing people not being very analytic, but at Amazon, marketing people needed to learn SQL. Like it was this whole thing where you basically had to roll up your sleeves and do take matters into your own hands. That example in particular, I think, is super interesting because it shows that you went above and beyond. However, and I have the leadership principle right in front of me. The ownership leadership principle literally states owners never say that's not my job. And I think that that's interesting because if you never say that's not my job, then how do you draw the line, right? How do you draw the line between doing everything yourself or driving to Canada and similarly then try to do somebody else's step on somebody else's toes or do somebody else's responsibilities? Like, how do you? I mean, obviously, there's a risk of becoming a people pleaser. How do you navigate that, or how have you navigated that in your time at Amazon and beyond?
It's such a good question because I think each of these leadership principles can be applied too far, right? And certainly with that statement in the leadership definition of that's not my job, or leaders never say that's not my job, which, by the way, as a quick aside note, if you want more context on how that made it into the leadership principle, go back and check out the episode with Ethan Evans. He was actually the VP at Amazon that was, kind of credited for getting that into the leadership principle itself. So fun story there. But yes, certainly being too much of a yes person and signing up for too much can make you a very good owner, but you can fall short on delivering results and all these other important areas that are critical for being an effective leader. So, I think the way that I like to think about the balance there, or finding a balance, is I'll also caveat this by saying, as a founder, sometimes I do have to have that ownership mentality of like, hey, no one's there to do it. I do have to step in and do it every time until that gets filled. And so it is a little bit situational or contextual on what role you're in. But I would say in general, the mental model I like to use is no matter what your role is, no matter what team or project you're involved in, think about yourself as first and foremost a highly invested board member of that project, that team, that, certainly the company you're at. And what I mean by that is if you think about, corporate boards, they have board members that aren't doing things on a full-time basis. They're meeting maybe just a few times a year, but they're very committed to finding solutions and doing what's best for the company. And there's that important part of the ownership leadership principle that says that they act on behalf of the entire company beyond just their own team. So an example of that would be, let's say you're in a marketing role and you're interacting with the finance team, and the finance team is trying to put together financial forecasts or something that, for all intents and purposes, let's say falls within the purview of the finance team, but they need your help. So I think an owner should step in and should help find a solution. An owner should not necessarily take over the project and do the finance team's work for them. But on the flip side, to be a good owner, that marketing leader should also not say, hey, that's finance. I'm not a finance person. You go figure it out. So I think acting first and foremost as an invested board member, you can say, well, here are some things that I've seen work in other businesses or other teams, other projects, or, here are some contacts I know, or let's jump on a phone call and explore the initial conversation and then figure out some next steps and the right owners for that. And so it's knowing when to not sign up for too much, but not just leaving things hanging, making sure that you're thinking about that long term interest. Happy to share some examples of my time at Amazon where I felt like this played out. But I would say, in short, using that mental model can help you do what's right, think long term, and not, just refrain from having any responsibility while also not signing yourself up for too much.
It's very interesting because it's not necessarily ownership in the sense of like, okay, I'll get everything done myself, right? But it's also not going to the extreme of like, well, that's not my job, which is clearly anti ownership, right? Just to kind of like paraphrase what I understood from your comment, it is kind of like finding a sweet in between both, right? Sometimes you'll have to go a little bit more into the stepping on somebody else's toes and tell them exactly what has worked in the past or what hasn't. And sometimes it is more sort of like hands off the wheel and figure it out and keeping some eye on the target, but still like our job is the entirety of the company, and I think that's what's really stand out from your answer. I wanted to, now that you mentioned and you were talking about ownership, and you were also mentioning in the previous question about your new endeavors and your new, I mean, you started this podcast, you then started, you consulted businesses, and now you have this other new company. How do you think ownership or any other of the leadership principles or any other of the learnings, frameworks, whatever that you've learned at Amazon really, what did you take with you to these new challenges?
Yeah, a lot, but not everything, right? So Amazon, when I left had 14 leadership principles, I believe now has 16. And so there's a lot that look, after spending 7 years there, was a bit ingrained and that I'd seen work really well, but not everything I took over. But if listeners haven't figured out by now, I do really like the ownership leadership principle. So needless to say, that is one of the traits that and priorities that I've taken with me. I try to embody and exemplify my own work, but is a team leader and a people manager, it's something that I vet for and look for in those that we bring into our organization as well. And I would say it's interesting because, as I mentioned, Triple Line is an agency, and agencies are known for many times not being the best examples of ownership, right? Like they provide a service, but at the end of the day, there's the common or stereotypical trade off between, like, well, we could have an internal employee that's really going to own something as a part of the company, or we can have an agency where they have the expertise and the specialized knowledge, but they're not maybe going to have the same ownership as our internal team. And that's really, I think, one area where we have tried to flip things on its head and not be your typical agency. We keep a really low client to senior strategist or brand manager ratio and really protect their time so that they can feel, and we tell them explicitly, like, you are supposed to be responsive and act as if you're part of that team. And a part of that is the vetting process, right? Looking for people. And look, I still use similar Amazon interview style questions in interviewing at my team now. So I think that's one application of, thinking like Amazon is actually taking some of the questions that interviewers ask and using them in a separate business to help vet for similar leadership principles. But the way one of the anecdotes that tells me that we are succeeding at this is we often get both solicited and unsolicited feedback from our clients. And the number one point of feedback that we get is that clients feel like we, or the person that, is their primary account manager, is an extension to their team. They feel like they can trust and rely and speak to them as if they're speaking to any of their other coworkers. And to me, that's a really big validation that that ownership is happening, and that they don't feel like, hey, are we bothering you? Are you giving us time of day? Or even thinking about us? But they actually feel like they can reach out to us like a member of their team. So yeah, look, as I said, it's not a business that's traditionally known for ownership, but I also think that that creates an opportunity for us to really differentiate how we work.
It's very interesting what you point out, because I can draw some analogies, and I imagine a lot of the people listening to this, they are either an account manager or a vendor manager, and there's also some analogies there, right? There are people who are sitting right now at Amazon or any other company, and their main job is to interact with people on the outside and make them feel that they themselves are part of their companies and are working on their behalf. Obviously, there's the company's interests as well, but this is kind of like an extension, like you mentioned, right? So I think that is definitely really relevant. In terms of like your company as a whole, you were mentioning about CPG companies trying to, I understand that there's a sustainability component to this. Can you describe that a little bit further so that everybody kind of like understands what your company's focused on?
Yes, look, at this point in 2024, end of 2024, there are a lot of service providers in e-commerce and particularly in the Amazon space. So again, part of the genesis of our company was, if we're going to be another service provider, what are we going to do differently? And this kind of comes back to maybe a little bit of the customer obsession piece, but we we didn't want to, and I didn't want to just be like the other competition out there, but actually fill a need that is really customer obsessed and doing something that is going to stand out. And so, through a number of conversations, along with some of the consulting projects that I was involved with, it became apparent to me that Amazon was introducing a lot of tools at the time to help brand owners really lean into the brand story and provide tools to narrow the gap between what a D2C brand can do online and what a marketplace like Amazon offers to brands. And so seeing that opportunity, also seeing this rise of Amazon's focus on the climate pledge and trying to lean into supporting sustainability. And then, frankly, just in my own network, being introduced to quite a few grocery and CPG brands that were creating better for you or more sustainable alternatives, that kind of just landed at this opportunity to, hey, let's lean into really helping these brands that are trying to be better for people and for the planet to tell their stories on Amazon and differentiate themselves. So while we have to do all of the, A to Z table stakes, advertising, listing creation, design, SEO, all the things that you have to do for an e-commerce brand, if we really lean into the community building, the storytelling, the third party certifications, the things that are going to differentiate brands that are trying to be purpose driven and do something a little bit different to help get that story across to consumers, we think there's an opportunity. So it was really making a bet on that opportunity. I would say it's played out so far. I still think it's day one to still a phrase from Amazon, and there's a lot more to come. But that's really what we try to do. And I think that not only does that help define what we do for our current and prospective clients, but it also aligns our internal team on what we're trying to do. It creates that ownership, you could say, again, in doing something bigger than just the daily tasks in front of you, but actually like what's the impact we're trying to have? We're trying to leave things better by helping, if we can add $10 million in revenue to better for you brands and do that 100 times, like that, that's going to add $1 billion in revenue for these brands that are actually doing something a little bit better than the entrenched incumbent brands that maybe are just focused on profitability or revenue growth and not really on challenging the status quo and trying to do things, like I said, better for health or better for the planet.
So inspirational. And I'm kind of like trying to connect the dots here. But if I kind of like learning more about your story, you're gathering some of Amazon's leadership principles that potentially you had already ingrained within you. Amazon just put a label to them, right? And then you gather past expertise in like grocery and CPGs in both the US and Canada. And then you had this idea of differentiation and doing something that's not like a me too, but more like something new and better off because it's something that helps the environment, helps other people, etc. I think that's sort of like putting all of the pieces together throughout your career into building something on your own. I think that's a great message because a lot of us in our careers feel like we're doing some things in silos and we don't really know where we're going with this. But ultimately, kind of like there's a path to tying all of our experiences together. And the other thing that I would love your input on is I hear you talk about leadership principles, Amazon day one. There's a lot of analogies that a lot of the listeners here are maybe taking right now on, well, ownership, customer obsession, day one culture in general. That's very entrepreneurial, right? And these people are right now sitting listening to this and they have a full-time job and they have a 9 to 5 and but they have in the back of their mind, as I assume you once had and I once had, were sitting there working for somebody else and thinking, wow, maybe someday I'll be able to build something on my own, right? How do you see that, or what words of wisdom would you share with somebody who's thinking about that, or maybe not even actively but passively thinking about someday kind of like jump from a corporate environment into an entrepreneur role? What would you advise to them? What would you say they need to be cautious about? I would be very curious to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I'm happy to share it because I feel like I do have a point of view on this in that I've myself lived through the experience of this fear of missing out that I think is on social media and in entrepreneurial circles. I think it's inevitable. If you're in a full-time corporate role or a job and you hear about people with their side hustle that then grew into $1 million business and then they were able to immediately just quit their job and be financially set. Or you hear these other stories, it's really easy to feel like, hey, I'm, clocking in, I'm working my corporate job and I'm missing out. I felt that way too. I felt like, going back to 2019, I tried a couple little side projects that sort of fizzled. And that's probably more on me or the opportunity than anything else. But uh, I've come to since believe that you don't have to have a side project. Yes, that works for some, but there's actually a lot of entrepreneurial development and preparation that can happen even within the job that you already have today. And I consider Amazon to have been the best place to have worked because it gave me a lot of those experiences. So I had entrepreneurial experiences just through the nature of helping to launch new programs, or like the example I had provided earlier of helping the category launch for Canada and grocery. Those helped me think like an entrepreneur and see things from different perspectives, wear different hats, things that now give me a lot more confidence when I face similarly ambiguous problems as a founder. And then I would also say that one of the things that I think Amazon, at least through the retail leadership development program that I know Jorge, both of us entered Amazon through, is that it helps develop you as a general manager by giving you experience, throwing you into multiple functions. And so that's one thing that I think, whether you do it formally by actually, making lateral moves within a company, or it's just taking on projects or subject matter expertise areas while you do your current job. I think that there are ways that many listeners can explore different functions or different areas than what they're already comfortable or accustomed to, that can develop more of that general manager toolkit so that when you do decide to maybe pull the trigger and start your own venture, you aren't just a marketing person. You can see things through a finance lens. You can see things through an HR or recruiting lens, all these really critical skill sets because you've had a little bit of exposure to them already through your job. So honestly, I think that's what I would focus on, not the, hey, I have to have a side project or a side gig, and that's the only path into entrepreneurship.
There's kind of like I think that's spot on. I 100% agree. There's a survival bias for sure. Like you're never going to hear an interview for somebody who hasn't made it, right? It's all about the people who make it. So you tend to think, oh my God, all of these people are making it, right? Nobody goes in and interviews the person who left their corporate role and actually didn't make it and had to go back, right? Nobody interviews that person. So we don't hear those stories. It would actually be very fun to hear those stories. But yes, I 100% agree. There's a lot of things that we can be doing on the side while we have our corporate roles to start dipping our toes. This whole idea of like overnight successes, or I left my job without anything and jumped into doing something from scratch, they're very Hollywood like. But the reality is, if you dive into them a little bit further, you'll realize that this person didn't really leave their job all of a sudden and start a new thing. They had sort of like that thing going around for like ages. And they just basically realized that it had some legs and then decided to jump the gun. Yeah, it's all very spot on what you're mentioning. I think that the other thing that you mentioned is about being a generalist versus a specialist, and I think that's the other thing that listeners might want to take as a sort of like a food for thought, is the fact that a lot of us, me included, you included, we have had a very diverse career. And here's also the cue for you to go back to last week's episode or last time's episode where Tyler interviewed me. But yeah, my experience is also very diverse. If you have such a diverse experience and a general management toolkit, yes, maybe you should be thinking about what future could look like when you launch something on the side, or you join a smaller company as a first hire or something like that, just because that's in the nature of everything that you've built. But there's companies like Amazon and many others that have this sort of like rotational programs. Those are also a really good place to start sharpening those general management skill sets. Tyler and I both are part of the retail leadership development program, as he mentioned. I don't know if that exists anymore as like with its own name, but there's definitely Amazon and other companies out there that host those type of rotational programs as well. With that, I want to go into the last question, which is kind of like I don't know if it's going to be a surprise or what, but after last interview, we began talking. Tyler, you have moved into other things since the last time that you were hosting this podcast. You now have another podcast. You can maybe tell us a little bit more about that as well. But we were talking about you passing the torch and having me take over and start interviewing some of the people within Amazon, outside of Amazon, but around this concept about thinking like Amazon, which we both agree is very powerful. We were both Amazonians. We both left Amazon and took a lot of things with us. There's a lot of negative press around Amazon all the time, I think. It comes and goes. But this is kind of like a space where we focus on the positive, and you have done a really amazing job. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this podcast in particular? What were you expecting to accomplish when you kind of like press record for the first time? Now, what you think, what are some highlights or things that you're taking with you? And then what are some things that you would want to see that this podcast do in the future now that you're moving on to other things?
Yes, and this is a very, I don't know, bittersweet or surreal is the better phrase. It's an interesting moment in passing the torch. Let me just, as Jorge mentioned, back up and just share why I originally started the Think Like Amazon podcast. So I had recently left. Look, it started over 3 years ago. So I had recently left Amazon, and as I left and I was starting to get involved in some of these consulting projects, there were two thoughts that were constantly in the back of my mind. It sounds trite, but honestly, I would go to bed thinking about these things. And one is, hey, I learned so much at Amazon, and 7 years is not a short time. So I feel like I really embedded a lot of these leadership principles into the way I work and have found a lot of effectiveness in doing so. How do I make sure that I don't just write all of that off and start over from scratch, but actually build on the things that I learned? And so the inevitable question was, well, how can I think like Amazon and apply those best principles and practices to my next job? And in conversations with others that had recently left Amazon, they were thinking the same thing. And so that's kind of the first thing that tipped me off to, like, there's some interest here. Like, this could be a good dialogue in talking about how to think like Amazon and how to apply these principles in other places. The second thing is that as I was going through these consulting projects, I would be constantly like referencing solutions that tied into mechanisms that Amazon had, be that, 6-page narratives, weekly business review processes, working backwards, having a bar raiser component to an interview loop. I could go on. And these were like breakthrough. I felt like I was cheating because I would get asked these tough questions by really thoughtful CEOs trying to figure out the next step in a difficult part of their business growth. And I would just be able to go back to my toolkit from Amazon, and not every time, of course, but many times find a mechanism from Amazon that really created this breakthrough moment for the business. And so it was those two kind of general like phases or experiences I was living through that really, and I had a little bit of free time because I had gone from working intense hours at Amazon to, drumming up consulting business. And so was really excited. And, I'm super pleased that the Think Like Amazon podcast quickly became one of the top rated management podcasts on Apple Podcasts within just a few months. And, at this time, I believe has been listened to over 80 or 90,000 times. Certainly, there's been some good reception to this podcast. As I stopped being consistent in publishing interviews, I started to get a lot of requests from those that had listened to past episodes saying, why, when are you gonna publish the next episode? We look forward to more content. And I was like, well, I'm busy now. I've already covered most of the leadership principles, and I've already tapped, a lot of my network, at least in terms of directors and VPs, that I've been connected with at Amazon. I don't know if I have the time for this right now, but as I thought and started and kept getting these requests, I was like, we really do need to keep this going. And that's the first time I thought about, like, well, if I can't do it, could somebody else do it? And, obviously not the best podcast host in the world. So the answer is yes, someone else could definitely do this. And not to just say this because you're here in this conversation with me, but honestly, the first person I thought of was Jorge, because I had sat through Jorge's effective leadership training. I don't know if it was probably called something different at the time, but your training at Amazon to be more efficient and effective in work. And I was like, this guy knows how to present these important soft skill and hard skill concepts in a way that, people from diverse backgrounds can really understand them. Great public speaker, and also somebody that really thinks critically and at a high level about how to apply things across organizations and across companies. And then I also, you and I had stayed in touch loosely. And so I also knew that you had recently left Amazon after a long career there, and a lot of success. So you clearly, had a lot to draw from, but also we're kind of in the same cohort of being a former Amazonian. So I had reached out to you, and I think we had a lot of back and forth conversations over a few months, and then I really have landed on what I think is just this great transition to take the Think Like Amazon podcast into its next phase. And I'm really excited and bullish to be listening in to some of the future episodes and guests that you're going to have on, Jorge, because I think that you're going to bring a whole another wealth of perspective and incremental set of ideas and experiences beyond what listeners have already heard from me. And so I think that for those that continue to stay tuned, you're going to get a lot of value out of these next episodes. And I'll also say that, one of the things that Jorge and I have talked a bit about is, as Jorge mentioned, Amazon continues to evolve and isn't necessarily the exact same company that it was even 4 years ago when I left. And so I think that I would guess that some of the content will also evolve to not just be, hey, this is Amazon's heyday, carbon copy these steps or these practices, but rather like thinking about what should you take and what should you leave, maybe, and when should you apply different principles to different situations. And I think, again, Jorge is the perfect host. So I'm really excited to continue to follow you and the podcast. As I mentioned, I've recently started a new podcast. It's called Profit and Purpose. And that podcast is specifically focused, I should say, on interviewing entrepreneurs of purpose-driven consumer product companies on how they have built companies while balancing both having an impact or purpose and building a profitable company. It's often harder done than said. And really excited about some of the episodes and guests that we've had that have kind of peeled back the curtain on some of the hard lessons that they've learned and some tips and advice there. So we'll continue to publish there, and you can check that out at profitandpurpose.show. Tune into both. I hope they both continue to be great podcasts.
Tyler, well, thank you for all the words of encouragement. Thank you for trusting the guy with a thick English accent. I think presenting and podcasting is a whole different game. But yeah, I think it's all about just you and I both have had a chance to reach out to the public and talk about like soft skills or leadership skills. It's all about putting in the reps. We're going to continue doing this. We're going to help others. I think that's the whole idea with all of this is we both wish we had a lot of this going around when we were at Amazon or beyond. So yeah, I think it's all about that. It's all about helping others. It's all about inviting people who are relevant. And I hope if you have listened to us this far, you would subscribe to this podcast. And then I'll put the details for your podcast, Tyler, in the meeting notes as well, in the description of this podcast, of this episode, and people can sign up to yours as well. And so I want to thank you a lot for everything that you've done. I was a listener of your podcast. You've interviewed former managers of mine like Kim Matheson, leaders like Ethan Evans, that I think nowadays is even more popular on social media and everybody knows who Ethan is, and other great former Amazon leaders. I think you can all go back and listen to some of those episodes. They're definitely insightful. And I hope to bring some more insightful people as well, to give my own twist to this, but continue with your legacy, which I think is the most important as well.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for having me. And again, this has been a lot of fun kind of being in the interviewee seat for this episode here.
Awesome. Thanks, Tyler. Have a good one.